The ability to focus the mind is pivotal to our reaching our goals across all domains of life, from health and relationships to our careers and life pursuits. The challenge, particularly to those with attention deficit hyperactivity disorder, or ADHD, is that our distractions have grown exponentially over the generations. That's not to mention those everyday indulgences that dilute concentration. How is dopamine, a key chemical driver of our focus, impacted by medication, diet, and how we spend our time? What boundaries need to be set, and what nutrients can be taken to optimize mental focus? Today, celebrated adult and child psychiatrist Dr. Daniel Amen will shed light on these and other aspects of improving focus for ADHD. Dr. Amen is best-selling author of Healing ADD, the breakthrough program that allows you to see and heal the 7 types of ADD. Welcome to Vital Signs, where we learn how to get healthier from all angles, from the biochemical and nutritional to the things we do that nourish our minds and our souls. I'm Brendan Fallon. Dr. Amen, it's fantastic to have you back on Vital Signs again.
It's great to see you again. Thanks for having me.
Particularly because apart from the fact that you have this expertise in psychiatry, child psychiatry included, I know that you also have this specific focus on detoxification and the value that that brings to mental health. Talking about ADHD, I know this is a rising problem in society. How have you seen this manifesting in your practice? How is it presenting as you see it these days?
Well, it's always been probably half of the children we see and maybe a quarter of the adults. It's a very common but increasing problem. And for the last 33 years, we've been looking at the brain, and I have 30,000 people who have ADD or ADHD of one form or another. And the big lesson early on is it's not one thing. A lot of people are diagnosed with it. Some get better with typical ADHD medications, but many people, those medications actually make them worse. And so we have to stop thinking of psychiatric disorders as single or simple disorders like ADHD or depression or OCD or post-traumatic stress disorder. They all have multiple types. And I actually wrote a book about ADD called Healing ADD, See and Heal the 7 different types. And so stimulants like Adderall or Ritalin help 2 of the 7 types, but they can make 5 of the 7 types worse. And so the hallmark symptoms, what we usually see in our practice, short attention span, but not for everything. It's short attention span for regular, routine, everyday things, schoolwork, homework, paperwork, chores. The things they love, they can pay attention just fine.
Like video games, I imagine.
Like video games, which are a dopamine dump. So Adderall works by increasing the availability of dopamine. That's how video games work. That's how social media works. That's how drugs work. And also distractibility, disorganization, procrastination. They don't do things until someone's mad at them to get it done. And impulse control issues. And ADHD is not a disorder of the moment, right? All of us have a little bit in us, especially when we didn't sleep well or were overwhelmed. It's these things throughout your whole life. So it doesn't just show up when you're 40. You could actually see evidence all the way back into childhood.
And you mentioned dopamine there, Dr. Amen. How does dopamine actually factor into a lack of focus in ADHD? What's actually going on in the brain to bring that effect?
So what we see, we scan people. We do a study called SPEC that looks at blood flow and activity. It looks at how the brain works. And we do 2 scans, one at rest and one when you concentrate. And when you don't have enough dopamine, when you try to concentrate, your brain drops in activity. And what that means is the harder you try, the worse it gets. And we all have only so much store of dopamine available. People who have ADHD actually have less. And so you find that they're always doing things to try to increase their own dopamine so they can be excitement seeking. It's like, why do people jump out of perfectly good airplanes? You have to ask yourself that question. Or they can be conflict seeking. They like poke at other people and they play this game I call Let's Have a Problem. They're always seeking more dopamine. They're at higher risk for substance abuse. In one study from Harvard, 52% of people who have ADHD untreated will end up with a substance use issue. That's a problem. And they often struggle in school because a lot of school is boring. A lot of school doesn't have its own sort of intrinsic excitement, intrinsic dopamine. And it's hard for them, which is why I always tell them you need to go into a profession that can support you, but you love, because love is a drug. Love is dopamine in many ways.
Interesting. So that's a natural way to sustain dopamine is to find a job that's rewarding. You mentioned substance abuse there. That brings to mind, I know that many of the medications used to treat ADHD are amphetamines, and then there's Ritalin, I understand, falls into another type of stimulant that's used to treat ADHD. You mentioned before that there's two types that respond well to medication. Overall, though, how do you balance that, the potential for addiction or other ill effects from medication and the potential benefits? How have you dealt with that?
Well, I think it's very important to have a really good assessment and have a healthcare person you trust that you actually tell the truth to mitigate against that. So I find when I diagnose it properly and I educate my patients, there's very little inappropriate use of the medication. In fact, if you overshoot the dose with kids or adults who have ADHD, they don't like how they feel. It sort of flattens how they feel. I have a daughter who has ADHD, and she had the hyperactive form, and the medicine was a godsend for her. But if I increased it too much, I could just see it flatten her personality, and she didn't like it. And you go, well, why is that? You're giving somebody a stimulant. And because you have to dial in the dose in a thoughtful way. The abuse dosages of these medications are much higher than the typical treatment dosages.
I see. And how can patients or how can parents ensure that their child is properly diagnosed with the specific type of ADHD that they have is diagnosed so that they can get the appropriate treatment?
Well, and this is sort of the crazy thing about psychiatry. It's the only medical profession that never looks at the organ it treats. So think about it. Cardiologists look, neurologists look, orthopedic doctors look. Every other medical specialist looks at the organ it treats. Psychiatrists guess. And I've been trying to change my profession for the last 30 years. I'm like, come on, if you don't look, you don't know. You then begin to assume, oh, you have ADHD. But very few people have one psychiatric diagnosis. It's actually, for people who come to see us, on average, they have 4.2. So it's usually ADHD and depression, ADHD and anxiety, ADHD and obsessive compulsive disorder. And if, at least for a practice like ours, it's very rare for people to just have one thing. And then it gets really tricky with medicine, because if you treat the ADD, you actually may make them more anxious or more obsessive or more irritable. And so I advocate we should look at the brain before we go about trying to change it. Another thing that's really important, I hate the term mental illness because it shames people, it's stigmatizing, it's wrong. These are brain health issues. And what that means, if you have ADHD, you really need to go to bed on time. You really need to like leave the dopamine dumpers alone, like constantly on your phone or social media or video games. It's so important to think of ADHD or depression or anxiety disorders. These are brain health issues. So I have to eat right for my brain. I have to exercise for my brain. And when you think of it as mental illness, it's like, oh, you have this, take this drug. When you think of it as brain health, you really start caring about your brain and then optimizing it with all the other strategies like diet, exercise, sleep.
Hello, I hope you're enjoying this Vital Signs episode. I'm your host, Brendan Fallon. If you or someone close to you has ADHD or just general issues focusing, we'd love to hear about it. Where do you have the most challenges? What do you find most helpful? If you're watching on TV, you can find Vital Signs at epochtv.com to leave a comment. And if you're finding this video helpful, please be sure to share it with family and friends by clicking that share arrow below. You've touched on a number of things there that I'd like to explore further, like the detoxification effect of sleep and also food. Food is increasingly identified as a factor in people's mental health and behavior. To what proportion, if you can put a proportion to it, of patients would you say is food, what they're eating, a factor in their ADHD?
Well, there's this fascinating study from Holland where they took 300 ADHD children, put them on an elimination diet. So they basically eliminated processed foods. And at the end of 3 months, 70% did not now meet the criteria for having ADHD. I think food is huge. And as a parent of children and grandchildren with ADHD, I always think fix food first. Fix food first. Because if you feed them properly, your brain is 2% of your body's weight, but uses 25% of the calories you consume. So if you have the standard American diet, think Taco Bell, you're not going to think right because it doesn't have the nutrients you need. And I'm just picking on Taco Bell because I saw the World Series and had like 6 commercials last night. But any fast food restaurant or any packaged food, processed foods, we were never meant to eat these foods. And the more ultra processed foods you have, the higher incidence of ADHD, depression, and dementia you're going to have.
Certainly more investigation is due into what's actually being put into this ultra-processed food. Caffeine, I feel, is another interesting one because caffeine would raise dopamine levels, as I understand it, and this would help to improve focus, including for people with ADHD. But it also comes with its costs. So how do you rate caffeine, as an overall positive or an overall negative entity?
We have to be just so thoughtful. Caffeine increases dopamine in the short run, but the problem is it's addictive. And when you stop, you get withdrawal and you get headaches. It also increases cortisol, which is a stress hormone. And the reason I don't like it is when I first started imaging, they did studies with caffeine and brain SPECT imaging, the study we do at Amen Clinics. It dropped blood flow to the brain 30%. And I'm like, oh no. Anything that decreases blood flow to an organ prematurely ages.
What explains that effect, Dr. Amen? Why would caffeine restrict blood flow to the brain?
Because it's a vasoconstrictor. It actually constricts blood flow. And blood flow is so important to your brain. Your brain is 2% of your body's weight, but uses 20% of the blood flow in your body. So you don't really want anything that constricts blood flow. Nicotine is the same way. It's addictive, more addictive than almost anything, and constricts blood flow to the brain. I published this very large study on aging in the brain, and nicotine was one of the things that caused premature aging, along with alcohol. And the worst of all, which was a shocker to me, was marijuana.
We've talked about some of the things that can have this toxic effect on the brain in terms of restricting blood flow, etc. I'd like to go into some of the things that can actually help the health of the brain and help enhance focus. You mentioned sleep before. I know this has a detoxification function. How does that work? How important is sleep to focus?
Well, when you sleep, your brain cleans and washes itself. And if you don't get enough sleep, so 7.5 hours for adults, then trash builds up and it's much harder to focus. I know when I cross time zones, or I try never to take a red eye, but if I do, I'm not making a big decision the next day because I'm not going to be thinking as well as when I get great sleep. When you don't sleep well, it actually turns off 700 health promoting genes in your body, which is a very bad thing. And you won't have good blood flow to your brain. So sleep is absolutely essential, which means you have to take your children's gadgets from them. Do not let them have devices in their bedrooms because they were made to be addictive. I believe purposefully made for mind share. They want as much of your child's mind and your mind as possible. And so at night, it's critical to turn them off. I can't tell you the number of patients I have where the parents think the child has ADD, but when we figure it out, they don't really have ADD. They're sleep deprived because they've been playing with their devices in the middle of the night.
Yeah, we see this everywhere, and I'm sure that there's a lot of suspicion about the effect of these devices on children and their ability to focus. Is it a case of, you were saying before that everyone has a limited amount of dopamine, so these devices, they stimulate dopamine, and they're kind of draining that supply? Is that what's happening?
Yes, and it's almost like kids get thrilled to death. And it sort of started in the 1980s when video games first came out, but video games have become much more rewarding, much more sophisticated, much more addictive. And now add cell phones and iPads. It's like everywhere you go, people are on 3 devices at once. They're watching television, playing on their computer, and have their cell phone or their iPad with them. It's nuts. It's a common, this is a very common dopamine draining issue.
You can see, I mean, most parents must be clued into this to some degree, but with the lifestyle these days, with the amount that parents work and the different pressures, I guess they're often looking for something to just keep their child occupied because they just simply don't have the time, or the child gets to the point where they are very attached to the device. Do you have any suggestions, or is there a strategy you'd offer for parents to deal with this situation, to give their child a healthier option?
Well, I always say that's why God gave you parents. If you just let your child do whatever the child wants to do, it's going to cause big trouble for them. So delay devices for as long as possible. The American Academy of Pediatrics actually recommends kids don't see any screens before the age of 3. So I think delaying it, don't use them as babysitters. I think that's a big mistake. In my book, Raising Mentally Strong Kids, I talk about the importance of chores. And before you ever give a child a screen, make sure their homework's done, their chores are done, and limit the amount of time they're on screens. Otherwise, your child is going to have a dopamine deficit, and you're going to think they have ADD or ADHD when they don't. I believe that's why God gave us parents. You need to be your child's frontal lobes, the part that supervises them, until theirs develops, which is not actually until their 20s.
In just a moment, Dr. Amen will reveal key supplements that can help improve focus. First, though, where do the colonies of bacteria, fungi, and other microorganisms, aka the microbiome, factor into women's health, including breast cancer prevention? Here is a look at my interview with Dr. William Davis, author of Supergut.
As a woman ages, skin aging, dryness, thinning of the dermal layer of skin, wrinkles. If your wife said, "Hey doc, I think I have SIBO," what do you think then? Well, I've got bloating and diarrhea. I have numerous food intolerances. I can't lose weight, all kinds of things.
What can be done? Why is it important?
So what can you do? Well, restore a healthy gastrointestinal microbiome, and a woman starts to lose her wrinkles. And she has a return of youthful musculature. There's preservation of bone density. There's an amplification of the immune response. There's increase in the intensity of love and affection for people close to you. There's an increase in generosity. There's an increase in acceptance of the opinions of other people. In other words, there's huge transformation in health.
Afterward, find a link to that video at the top of the comments and also in this video's description below. And to get notice of new Vital Signs videos, follow me at Vital Signs Brendan on Instagram and Facebook, and at C Vital Signs on X. We've talked about medications a bit, which can be beneficial in some cases and also have negative side effects with addiction and things like that. What about on the supplement side? Is there anything naturally that can help improve focus for a child?
Certainly. I'm a big fan of omega-3 fatty acids. I did a study, almost 90% of the population is low in omega-3 fatty acids. And there's two types, EPA and DHA. EPA has actually been found to be more effective to enhance focus and mood than DHA. So EPA, omega-3 fatty acids can be helpful. And one of my favorite supplements is saffron. Saffron actually has 5 studies showing it helps with attention in people who have ADHD.
And what kind of amounts, what quantity would you recommend for those?
So for omega-3 fatty acids, over a gram of EPA and DHA and 30 milligrams for saffron.
The omega-3 I've certainly heard about before. Saffron is definitely a new one, and very interesting to hear that can help improve focus too. Just lastly, Dr. Amen, we know that sugar has its array of negative effects on the body, but this is something that I understand can also improve raised dopamine levels. So is there kind of a paradox there where sugar can have some benefit for someone with focus issues, but also carries certain problems?
Yeah, so there's no long-term benefit of sugar. Although one of the reasons, you have to ask yourself, why when you go to a restaurant are the first 2 things, so they give you bread and then they want you to have alcohol, right? They put bread on the table and they go, what do you want to drink? Both of those, so bread quickly turns to sugar in your body almost immediately. As you increase sugar, it actually drops the function of your frontal lobes. And it makes you happy in the short run because it boosts serotonin. And a lot of people don't know serotonin is another neurotransmitter that decreases activity in your frontal lobes. So you're happier, but more impulsive. And then alcohol drops frontal lobe function further, which just means that's why you're going to order more at the restaurant and make more money. They make more money if they give you bread and alcohol to start.
Thank you very much for joining us today, Dr. Amen. Fantastic to get your insights on natural ways to boost focus for ADHD and deal with the toxic factors of food and drugs and things like that. I look forward to having you on the show again soon.
Thank you. Thank you so much.
We've learned how levels of dopamine, the feel-good hormone, can be influenced by things we eat, like sugar, the devices we use, and even our choice of job. And we heard how getting good quality sleep and the right nutrition can both naturally improve focus. Find the link to my earlier interview with Dr. Amen, Is Marijuana Safe? And also my look with Dr. Davis at women's health and the microbiome at the top of the comments and also in the description below. And you can subscribe to access these and other news and health insights by clicking that big red button below. It's been great to be with you. I'm Brendan Fallon, and this is Vital Signs.